Welcome back to the Forecast Contest webinar series. My name is David Margolin, and I'm today's host. I'm very excited to introduce today's guest speaker and friend, Dr. Michael Ventrice. I hope I can call you Mike for this call.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, Mike is meteorologist at DRW, where he's tasked with quantifying weather risk in the natural gas and other commodity markets. Dr. Ventrice, Mike, is also the meteorological software engineer and project manager for interns. Quite a plateful. For today's discussion, Dr. Ventrice, Mike, is going to focus on his vast research and applied background in forecasting tropical forcing and signals and their impacts on global weather. Dr. Ventrice will provide a one-on-one of sorts on various tropical forcing signals and how they impact the U.S. weather and perhaps also tropics. Without further ado, Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks for having me, Dave. So let's jump into it here and talk about some of the things here. The focus of the discussion today will be mainly in regards to how to enhance our subseasonal to seasonal predictability. And a lot of this comes from some of my work done in my PhD, but also, comes from experience from when I was a forecaster back at WSI, which was the professional division of the Weather Channel back then, which essentially I worked in subseasonal prediction and enhancing that. Whenever I start with subseasonal prediction, one good thing to look at is the tropics. So, we'll talk about things like the Madden Julian Oscillation, something that can help our subseasonal predictability. And then we'll move into things like, if we have time, El Nino, La Nina, or ENSO. And I call these atmospheric standing waves because I care about ENSO, but I also care about other modes of variability that are driving tropical convection at lower frequencies. And essentially the atmospheric coupling mechanism to that in the ocean is called a standing wave. I do want to throw out an important note here. There are other types of weather phenomena that can actually overpower the tropics in any given season. So while we like to look at the tropics to help us these longer range forecast calls, it can cause you to get burned some of your forecasts if there are some of these other modes that are overpowering the tropics. And that's something important to know, because when I first started work at WSI, I didn't think of that. I thought, hey, the tropics drive everything, but no, there's other things that can overpower them. So let's talk a little bit basic here and talk about our Madden Julian oscillation and get a little bit of background information on this. So the MJO is a wave number one baroclinic circulation, where you have one area of rising air and one area of sinking air around the hemisphere. We call that a wave number one circulation. And it couples with large scale variations of convection in the tropics. Depending on each MJO event, they're actually all different. They can have different phase speeds depending on the background state, but it takes about 35 to sometimes 60 days to make a full orbit around the globe. These features propagate eastward only, and it is the most dominant form of interseasonal variability in the tropics, especially when you look at things like rainfall and wind and convection or clouds, etc. I do have a video that I don't know if it's going to work here. Let's take a look here and bring this up. So I wanted to kind of illustrate what an MJO convection actually looks like. And this is an example back in 2011 in October, where we see an MJO event developing along the equatorial Indian Ocean. We typically see these cloud structures. You see more white shading in the maps that become more organized. Sometimes you'll get these low-level gyres on both sides of the equator that can spin out tropical cyclones when the MJO event starts to pass, and you get the low-level westerlies along the equator. And then you see the envelope of convection generally slide eastward with time. So this is a nice example of an MJO event I could find just on ad hoc on YouTube. So when I look at these MJO structures, I typically identify how the circulation of the MJO event evolves. And that's more focusing on the upper level circulation, because I really want to understand if the atmosphere is fully coupled with a particular MJO event. And if there is such an event that's coupled, you'll typically see, like, again, an area of upper level divergence on one side of the hemisphere and maybe an upper level convergence on another side of the hemisphere. The standard way of looking at the MJO in the industry is looking at a real-time multivariate MJO index. This is known as these MJO phase space diagrams, right? Where you have different phases that represent different geographical locations. If you're inside this little circle in the middle here, it's like you can see some of these black lines here and dates. That's essentially a weak MJO event. And then sometimes you can get outside that circle. That's a 1 standard deviation ring. So once you're outside that 1 sigma ring, it's essentially considered a stronger event. And this was essentially a forecast back when I grabbed this in October 11th. So probably like what, last Friday or so. We're indicating there's some signal for a West Pacific MJO event as the MJO index starts to come out and the forecast lines start to come out in phases 6 and 7, which are the Western Pacific. And one way to kind of easily see this is by looking at upper level wind circulation for each MJO phase. And essentially the blue and purple shading represents the upper level divergent branch of the MJO. You can think of it as like the rising air section of it or convectively active phase. And then there's these yellows and oranges and reds. It's essentially the upper level convergent branch of the MJO or the suppression, where you see air subsiding and you generally have reduced convection. So each phase of the MJO represents a different location physically around the globe of where there's an active and suppressed phase of the MJO. We always, this RMM phase space diagram is actually designed to identify where the active phase is, but we always forget there's actually a suppressed phase somewhere else on the other side of the hemisphere. So like an example of phase 1, when the MJO is the blue and purple shadings are located over the Atlantic Ocean, that's where your MJO is passing the Western Hemisphere. And you have the suppressed phase of the MJO moving across the date line over the Western and Central Pacific. And you can then, as you go down from top to bottom for phase 1 to phase 8, you can generally see how the MJO passes, the active phase passes the Indian Ocean and moves across the Pacific Basin. And then eventually it'll get back to phase 8 where it starts to move over the Eastern Pacific. And then you kind of repeat the cycle from there. So how does most folks relate this to mid-latitude weather? Well, one common approach is to take all days in our MJO phase space diagram or MJO phase space framework and find where the MJO amplitude was greater than 1 standard deviation for each phase, and then draw composites across seasons or months to understand how these phases impact something like temperature departures from normal. And I took this from the CPC page, and essentially it just shows you what the January, February, March seasonal composite is. This is like your mature winter phases or season, and understand like, okay, when the MJO is located over one location, what does it mean, et cetera. So typically the rule of thumb is when your MJO is passing the Western Hemisphere, phase 8 into phase 1, 2, and 3, that's typically your colder MJO phases. And then as your MJO active phase moves back across the maritime continent and the Western Pacific, phases 4, 5, 6, 7, et cetera, that's essentially your MJO warm phases across the eastern 2/3 of the nation. The problem with this approach, through experience and through techniques throughout my career, is that these MJO events can have, some phases may have stronger suppressed phases than active phases, which the RMM PCs will have a hard time understanding that. The RMM framework, these EOF-based indices. Some events are zonally narrower than others spatially. Some events are slow, some events are fast. Some events have significant extratropical interactions, others do not. The method of compositing these 1 standard deviation MJO events will not capture the spectrum of events that can actually happen here, or those mid-latitude interactions. So while this is a great rule of thumb, I've noticed in my career that doing this and trying to say that each event's going to fit perfectly into these composites will eventually run you into problems. One thing that is probably the most clearest, though, and this is to me, is the relationship between the MJO and Atlantic hurricanes. Now, there's a lot of work that goes into like understanding how the MJO enhances like activity over the tropical Atlantic basin. We typically see like the rule of thumb is when the MJO is over the Indian Ocean, that's typically where we see an uptick in Atlantic tropical cyclogenesis. Your phases 1, 2, and 3. That's where we typically see these rises in the MJO indices. I'm showing the RMM index here. This is the gray one, the standard metric, and then I'll also show this velocity potential MJO index that I created with actually Matt Wheeler and Harry Hendon to kind of explore a different index method. And you see pretty good consistency here, where we typically have enhanced tropical cyclogenesis in phases 1 through 3 and suppressed phases generally 5 through 7 or so. But the real clear signal is hurricane days, where we typically see a really nice peak in Atlantic hurricane activity. Now, understanding when we're looking at just hurricane intensity level now in phases 1 through 3, and then you have a real significant minima in phases 6, 7, and 8. So where this kind of equates to, you have 4 times more likelihood of an Atlantic hurricane over the basin when your MJO is over the Indian Ocean compared to when the MJO is over the Eastern Pacific. It's like the nicest, cleanest signal you can see. So kind of moving into, where I've kind of gone more significantly is spectral filtering. And this is essentially a little bit more intense mathematics, but by combining like near real-time observations from like, let's say example, the 0-hour GFS, what essentially is initialized with the GFS model, and then like a long-range subseasonal forecast appended onto it. And then you do some nifty math where you apply zeros on both sides of time zeros. You can actually filter for the MJO circulation in wind data, like upper level wind data. This is velocity potential anomalies. So like the black dash contours are essentially representing where the active phase of the MJO is, or essentially where the upper level divergence branch is. And the suppressed phase is essentially where the solid contours are. And you'll typically see the dash contours coincide with like blue shading. That's the unfiltered velocity potential anomaly field. And the solid contours typically correlate with the like warmer colored, the oranges and reds. So, you don't technically need filtering on, you can see this in the unfiltered fields, like especially if you look at it like August 23rd here, back this past summer, you had nice suppressed amplification over the date line, and you had an active MJO event pushing across the Indian Ocean. You can see that in the unfiltered fields, but the contours are there just to help you. But I've kind of moved more in my career towards these spectral filtering analyses because they can do a couple of things for you. They can actually tell you amplitude really nicely and cleanly. The more contours you can see, like the stronger the event. And they tell you precision-wise, look at like the longitude of where the MJO is. You can see where the leading phase of the active phase of the MJO is, and where it's, essentially how far longitudinally it expands across the hemisphere. One question that Dave, you had in the write-up is, how do models handle the MJO? And do we see any issues with them? And I wanted to point out, before the models were upgraded to their 4D VAR assimilation schemes, the models had a really tough time with predicting the active phase of the MJO across land masses. So we typically heard of things like the maritime continent barrier, where the active MJO would hit the maritime continent, get stuck there and go back to the west. We actually saw the same type of features over South America and also over Africa. And I did some work here to kind of show that this doesn't have like MJO filtering on it, but you can see the same coloring scheme here for velocity potential anomalies. You look at the actual reanalysis, you have the slow west to east drift with time in the Hobnoller analysis, with the MJO active phase kind of moving across the Atlantic basin. But if you look at model land, like this is the GFS NCEP, you actually never see that eastward propagation. It just kind of gets stuck there and it kind of goes back to the west with time. The ECMWF did a much better job at this time with resolving these types of eastward progression things. But I just wanted to say, like, back before these assimilation schemes were updated, the models had a significant time like struggling with understanding how the MJO propagation would go across land masses. But since they've updated this, like we're talking about like probably since 2012 now, they've gotten a lot better. So they are a lot more reliable at kind of predicting these things. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was one of the new methodologies that I've kind of developed now when trying to use the MJO to help make subseasonal forecasts. And this is no longer a subjective process for me. It is completely automated, and it's using some form of machine learning / AI, but it's leveraging that spectral filtered MJO field now, right? So we can actually tell you, and this is just an example, where the active phase of the MJO is at any given point, the blue contours, the blue shading, and where the suppressed phase is. And what I can do now is I can actually go back and run an algorithm that tells me what years spatially match these signals the best in the same, using a reanalysis data set of MJO filtered velocity potential anomalies, and then also incorporate amplitude into that equation. So now I can say with precision, what MJO events do we look spatially and match the best, and what events were the strongest in amplitude, and then you can apply them in a rank, a system, some kind of ranking system, or you can create PDFs of outcomes using analog method. But this is kind of where I've evolved into, because there, the nice thing about velocity potential is there are some times where you get some strong off equatorial signals in the MJO filter field, and typically when you get some of those stronger off equatorial signatures, it actually correlates with a stronger interaction with the mid-latitudes. So you're essentially looking at like interactions with jet streams. This is kind of how I've evolved throughout time. And you can do a couple of nifty things with this. Actually, I took this from my statistical model for this week. From actually, I think it was initialized today for like looking at week three's forecast. And you can do like take those historical years and the weights and kind of provide a weighted out approach for departures from temperature anomalies. So looking 3 weeks out, this is like centered on the second week of November. You can see what historically has happened in essentially of like historically, how does that translate to the forecast moving forward? So you can do like you give a deterministic approach of like, oh, the US looks like it's going to be leaning a little bit warmer than normal, but it's not a strong signal. But you can get any point around the globe to kind of see what this could do. And then you can take those historical analogs for years and build out PDFs and show what the weather adjusted PDF is based on the MJO compared to climatology. So that's what like these red contours are. That's the MJO distribution, adjusted distribution for like looking at max temperatures in the Northeast. This is New England Power Pool for the same time frame. And you can see if there's any shifts in the distribution compared to climatology, which is the gray contours. And you can see here in this instance, yeah, Northeast has a little bit of a shift in the warmer direction based off your MJO statistical model. Now, the one thing I wanted to say here, and this is a major key point here, is that when you are looking at the MJO as a predictor for your subseason predictability, you need to see a couple of things first, right? First off, you want to rely on your MJO statistical models in the cold season. And that's essentially you're going into fall, into winter, and then early spring months. And that's because your jet streams are further equatorward. So your tropical convection associated with the MJO can actually perturb the jet streams a little bit more, since that it's actually the jet streams a little bit further south than compared to like the summer months. Now you can still use the MJO in the summer months as a predictor, but now you're starting to rely on more of like MJO/hurricane or typhoon type of relationships and how those interactions happen with the jet streams, because you need some kind of facilitator of that energy up into the mid latitudes, since your jets are a bit further poleward now. So I typically rely on these statistical models more so in the cold season than the summer season. But the real big thing here is you need to have a sufficiently strong MJO event to trust it, right? And like, for example, today, when I showed you that MJO statistical model, yeah, it showed you something, it showed you a shift, but then you look at the actual MJO state and those block dash contours, you don't really see a whole lot, right? It's actually pretty weak when looking at the current state and saying, hey, this is the MJO forecast, but in reality, as a forecaster, I look at the state and say, hey, it's not a super strong state. There's got to be something else that I can leverage here instead of the MJO model because of the lack of confidence of a significantly strong event. So that's the thing I wanted to point out here, is that as we kind of evolve in this process here, I'm gonna have to figure out a way to develop a reliability index that goes hand in hand with the MJO forecast. So you can understand when there are times you can actually use this forecast versus times where you should rely on the numerical weather prediction models instead, for example. Okay, so that was the MJO section. Dave, I don't know how you want to structure this. If you want me to just keep going into the next part of the discussion, or we want to kind of stop here and ask any questions on that.
If you don't mind, just one question.
Yeah.
So, and I have to say, I have to interject one thing. I think every time we meet and I see, and I don't see enough anymore, but I learned something new about tropical forcing, starting with the first time more than 10 years ago when you taught me all kinds of stuff about Kelvin waves and their impacts on tropical cyclones. So it was really good. But my one question is, I feel like there's a rule of thumb out there. You were just kind of touching on this with that you're going to get a better signal if the MJO is stronger. Can you say anything about forecast predictability? Like, in other words, either experientially or based on research that you've done, all things being equal, if I don't know, you're making a 6, 10, or 11 a day forecast and you have a million MJO events that are above one amplitude, if in theory you could have that, and then you have this other subset of a bunch of MJO events where the amplitude is less than 1. Just in terms of predictability, model skill, if you will, do you think you're going to see better skill in those situations where the MJO is strong?
It's a good question, and it's actually one that's not trivially easily to answer. And that's because location matters at the MJ active phase, I suspect. Specifically when your MJ is passing like the Pacific Basin, you're probably going to see an uptick in Westpac typhoon activity, which then, as we know, if there are going to be certain forecasts or ensemble members or events that you got a strong typhoon up into the higher latitudes, that's going to cause volatility in your model forecasts. So that's probably going to bring your skill down, right? When looking at overall statistics. I would suspect that your MJO predictability, though, or your model predictability at subseasonal levels probably does become more skillful or reliable during stronger events. That's a gut, though, because I could see an argument based on the opposite of saying, hey, what if the models miss the amplitude of the event at longer leads? Now we're or they're too slow with the event or too fast, and that can cause errors in the forecast. So, I mean, like I could see both arguments. It's something that I haven't really seen, though, in regards to like statistics at this point. When just looking at like 500 millibar correlation coefficient scores or something, and kind of like looking at that. It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, Dave, in all honesty.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Yeah. And I certainly don't either. It's one of those, I feel like the rule of thumb is better skill. I feel like, or at least there's something, I don't know. I feel like I've heard that, but you're right. Actually what your response was helpful because, sometimes these rules of thumb, they're not always, there's not always factual, information to back it up. And it sounds like the jury's still a little bit out in terms of actual better skill on that.
I will say this: if you do develop an MJO statistical model, you're going to see better skill when you have stronger MJ events versus weaker. You will see that.
That makes sense. Okay.
But actually, the models themselves in predicting 2 meter temperatures or some field, that's something that would still be left open for research or exploration.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so I'll switch over to more so the lower frequency stuff, and this is more to help with like seasonal forecasts. So the industry, it lives or dies, here by the El Nino Southern Oscillation, ENSO, for seasonal prediction. And that's because ENSO explains like 30% of the variance at longer leads, so it's our best predictor in the community to make these long range forecasts. Now, the industry standard is to look at ocean temperature anomalies across the sliver of the equator in the central and eastern Pacific Basin and say, okay, it's a strong El Nino if like ocean temperatures are warmer in the central box or colder than normal, it would suggest a La Nina, right? So that's the essential standard metric. But the problem with that is it doesn't really tell you anything about how the atmosphere is coupling with the ocean. You have to make an inference, right? The general inference is when you have El Nino conditions, you have a lot of rising air over the central and eastern Pacific and sinking air over the maritime continent and the Western Hemisphere, and vice versa. In La Nina, you get a lot of rising air over the Westpac and convection, and you get general subsidence over the Eastern Pacific. But I can tell you right now that this does not work all the time. It's actually a spectrum of events. And one thing that I've done in throughout my career is to develop a way to quantify the atmospheric response to some of these slower evolving modes in the ocean, like ENSO, example, El Nino. And one of the clearest ways to see it in El Nino coupling is like just looking at like the strongest event, one of the strongest events in history, right? The super El Nino of 1997. And you essentially take a low pass filter now on like a 200 millimeter velocity potential field, which represents air diverging aloft or air converging aloft. The blue and purple contours represent where air is diverging aloft. The yellow and red is essentially where air is converging or subsiding. So you can think of this as like sinking air and then rising air. And then you can see how that evolves with time in the Hofmüller diagram. So this is your x-axis here. This is just looking at January 1st, 1997, all the way to the winter, December 31st. And then your x-axis is longitude here. There's numbers. If you don't like those numbers, there's a little mini map underneath. You can see where you are in the world. And the 1997 Super El Nino started to take place in the summertime. We saw this blue shading start to drift eastward with time. And we really saw a significant coupling in the fall of 1997, right over the Eastern Pacific Ocean, right? You think these purple contours, that you could see them, they're kind of generally centered between like 120 to 135 west. That's east of the date line, and it shows a significant El Nino coupling in the atmosphere. You see your significant suppression over the West Pacific. Actually, over Africa, though, you actually get mixed signal. Now, let's compare that to 2020. 2020 was not a significant El Nino, right? It was actually more of a La Nina event, but it was different. It wasn't really a La Nina event because you expect La Nina to have all your forcing over the West Pac, but it was actually to the west of that. Your Indian Ocean was where your atmospheric coupling was most anomalously. Your tropical convection was most forcing, and you had a lot of divergence over the Indian Ocean. It was like that for pretty much all the year. And recall 2020 was one of the most hyperactive hurricane seasons of all time. Right? It was 2020 or 2021. 2020 and 2021, both of the years were hyperactive. But this was a strong signal for the Indian Ocean. So, the atmosphere is going to respond here differently because this is an Indian Ocean event. It's not a West Pac event. So being able to go in and diagnose the state of atmospheric coupling to these slower frequency modes is important because you're getting added information in to understand where the maximum forcing and longitude is. Let's take a look at the current stance, right? Now you can actually look at a global picture now of this field instead of a Hobmauler, just kind of see where things are kind of rising and sinking, and you can see the most anomalous rising areas over Africa, the Indian Ocean, and especially over the South Pacific. The Eastern Indian Ocean, excuse me. But it's actually shifted south of the equator. You get a nice extension into Australia. This is one of those things I was talking about with like understanding there's some kind of significant interaction with the mid latitudes now because you see the signal kind of bleeding into the subtropics and extratropics of the southern hemisphere. So that's the active phase, where there's like a rising air. There's definitely a standing wave over the Indian Ocean, Eastern and maritime continent. You look over the Pacific, though, we're in a La Nina state, but you don't see your West Pac forcing at all. It's all suppression east of the maritime continent, and you get all the subsidence now in the central and eastern part of the basin. So you can do the same approach in a statistical model where you can take this information in a spatial form and find your similar states in history and do through a machine learning technique, a pattern recognition algorithm, to understand similar times in history where we've seen a really strong resemblance of the current state. And you can actually show, so this is like a time series that I have running all the time to show me which years best match the current state. And the index to the number to the right of that is actually the Pearson correlation coefficient. So a perfect correlation is a positive one, a perfect anti-correlation is a -1. So if you look at the best match year right now to the current state, it's 2010. You have a 0.93 spatial correlation. The worst matching year is 1982, which is a -0.89. So this is a way that you can kind of find, build your low frequency forcing analog states to kind of best match your current state of year. And then you can develop some interesting statistics from that. The other thing to mention is amplitude is important. So there are years where there's stronger events, stronger atmospheric coupling events than others. So 2022, you can see the green line. It's essentially, it's close to about a standard deviation in amplitude, maybe almost a little bit higher. But the strongest years really stand out here. 2015, 1997, those are your super El Nino years. Now I'm showing you amplitude. And this is not just amplitude location. This is actually just amplitude generally in a sense of standing wave, right? When was there a strong standing wave and when was there a weak standing wave? And so like 2015, that's a year we had the strongest standing wave on record. That happened to be El Nino. 1997 was the second one there, as another super El Nino. But there are some La Nina years that get in there, like 2020 was a very strong La Nina year. But then you look at the other side of the spectrum, this easily tells you when there are years where there wasn't a strong La Nina or El Nino or any atmospheric standing state in general. So I tend to look at these two columns independently or together, excuse me, and I say, okay, 2010 was the best spatial correlation map. And I look at the amplitude. Well, it was a bit stronger than what the current year is. So it may not be the most perfect match when considering amplitude, but it's a really good spatial map regardless, right? The problem with this is we don't have a huge sample size, so it's hard to really slice and dice the data. So I typically just kind of leverage the spatial correlations rather than the amplitude, because if we start getting into amplitude constraints, now you're gonna reduce your sample size to maybe like just 3 or 5 years, right? Which is not really enough to cover a spectrum of outcomes. I hope with time this methodology will evolve and we'll get more sample size with time, but regardless, that's kind of where we're at. So using the current state of the standing wave and projecting it forward, we can actually look at long-range forecasts. And this is like looking at, for example, January 2023. So this upcoming January. So what is the statistical model suggesting for the 500 mole height anomaly pattern? Well, it's there could be some kind of ridging out across the northeast Pacific into the Aleutians to get some kind of downstream trough across Western North America that bleeds into the Northern Hemisphere. What does that relate to 2-meter temperature anomalies? Okay, you get below normal temperatures across Canada into the northern tier, you get above normal temperatures across the southern US. This looks very La Nina to me when you're looking at like a canonical winter model and then so, right? But then you can actually go a step further and take those like use weather adjusted or La Nina or standing wave adjusted forecasts of, like, let's say, CONUS gas weighted HDDs. And how does that compare to the historical distribution? And you can kind of bin out your range of outcomes here. So you can say, okay, like your distribution for January could be anywhere from, like, your pretty much bulk distributions like sub 900, but you do have some cases where you can get into like the 950 to 975 range. But there are tailed outcomes here that could be sub 800 based off of similar years back in history. So this is, I'll look at this during strong states, but it is also a good rule of thumb to match up numerical weather prediction models, like the ECM System 5. And this is something that I developed at DRW to help us kind of understand what the numerical weather prediction is showing, in addition to the statistics, right? Yeah, like the La Nina or the ENSO or standing wave base state examples. But this is a nice and easy way to take the ECM System 5 bias corrected distribution, where the red shows the 10th percentile, the tan is the median, and then the blue is the 90th percentile. And you can kind of span the historical distribution to show you where the risk is to the forecast. And you can see how the median in this forecast is generally just below the 10-year normal. That's this like horizontal bottom line here, around like 888 HDs. There's warm tails into like the second lowest on record, and cold tails to like above the 30-year normal. And when looking at your weather, your ENSO standing wave adjusted distribution, you see some edge cases here, right? Some low level risk for sub 800 HDs, but you also see the distribution generally, like the highest frequency outcome is below that 900 mark, but you still have opportunity to get into like the 950s to low 1000s. It's not out of the question. So anyway, this is kind of I just wanted to share an example of some of the innovation that I've been working on to kind of help us quantify some of the seasonal forecast risk, but also not just show statistical model, but also understand that numerical weather prediction model is very useful. And understanding how these leans in the distributions, not just the ensemble mean, but looking at the actual range of outcomes of the distribution, to be able to quantify that is kind of paying off fruit in that regards, because it can actually help you when there's significant leans in a given season, and you can compare what those leans are to what the vendors are saying, for example, to understand where the opportunity is in a given season, and understand the range of outcomes in a quantitative sense using a numerical weather prediction model, in addition to statistical, like tropical statistical models. Using them together has been the best, is the most efficient or best recipe for success that I've found, at least in my career, not just looking at statistical models. Anyway, Dave, that's all I got for you. We can stop there, and if there's any questions you have.
No, Mike, this has been great. And unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but I do have two quick questions if I can.
Sure.
If you don't mind actually going back to your slides, the one with the list of analogs, the one right before this one.
Yeah, right here.
And yeah, there it is. And I just have to say too, so I have two quick questions on this before I go through that. Just seeing some of these products that you've shared with us today, I mean, it really shows how you combine all these great skill sets in terms of like the forecaster hat, the applied research meteorologist hat, the software engineer hat, and also just really creative and always trying to find answers to problems and stuff. You can see that in your work, and I hope that it inspires other folks who see this video, and other folks who work with you and have a chance to meet with you in the future. So really nice work here.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it.
Sure. And okay, the two quick questions here that just jump off the page to me here. One is, and I'll ask them both, and then you could answer them. One is there any relationship here with the amplitude between the volatility you would expect in the season? And I guess the reason that thought even crossed my mind, besides the fact that maybe something with the, having a stable sort of standing signal versus not could play something. I saw that last year, 1989, and I'm old enough to remember that. I lived through that, and that was one of the had a great whiplash of a season where we went in the Northeast here, where you and I are from, the warmest, one of the coldest December, November periods ever, to one of the warmest Jan Febs, at least at the time. And then my second question is related to this. Is there any value that you talked a lot about how the tropics very important, but you also have to consider the extratropics, and sometimes extratropics may drive things, stratospheric signals, what have you. Is there any thought, or do you see any value in trying to develop kind of these kinds of indices at the extratropical level that you've developed at the tropical within the tropics system?
Yeah. Okay. So let's start on the first question, and understanding like years where there's low amplitude versus years where there's high amplitude. And unfortunately, it's not a cookie cutter answer, because the years with low amplitude events, it means that there's something. It means that something else is driving the pattern, right? So if there's volatility in your extratropical pattern or your stratospheric tropospheric interaction climate interface, you can still get volatility. Now, the thing I do want to say is typically when you're in a strong El Nino state where you have significant coupling, that's that's usually the years where we have low volatility in the pattern in the wintertime. La Nina, though, if you have a high amplitude La Nina event, you're gonna have a lot of volatility because you have the North Pac ridge flex, and you get these cold fronts that come through, and you just get a ton of volatility in the North American pattern. So that is the answer that I have that isn't totally direct, but it I guess the take home message is if you have a strong El Nino, those are typically the years with the less volatility, usually, especially when you have a high amplitude standing wave event. But that is not the same for La Nina events. If you have a high amplitude La Nina event, you can still have a lot of volatility because of the North Pacific pattern in general.
Gotcha.
Your second question, and this is where I've been most interested in kind of evolving this type of work, is yes, understanding stratospheric tropospheric interactions and how that impacts the mid-latitude pattern. And we're talking about now getting out of the tropics and moving into a different part of the climate interface that is kind of becoming more popular, I would say, over the last 5 to 10 years. And there's a lot of really useful information that can come from stratospheric tropospheric interactions. And I'm gonna actually, I think I'm sharing my screen here, but can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, so this is something that I've been developing, and this goes back and it essentially develops something called the northern and northern mode, where it's essentially we receive the blue shading. You're going to get as positive NAM anomalies, which is coincides with like a positive AO, positive MAO state. It's essentially block free, and then the opposite true is for negative anomalies, where you have more blocking because it's like a negative NAO, a negative AO state. And there are times where there is predictability in these states. Now, I've noticed two different types of predictability cases. One, let's just say you have a face ripping strong stratosphere polar vortex, and you have a very strong positive NAM state that just stays there for a number of months, like what happened back in 2020 and into the spring months. You had like a 3 standard deviation positive NAM state. This is a pressure by time plot. So the bottom of the time series here is your like surface levels. And then you get up to like 100 or above, that's your stratosphere levels. So you can see like strong anti-blocking. That was a predictability, a base state that the stratosphere set up in the stratosphere troposphere, and that just stayed there. It eventually reversed in the summer months, but it was something that could predict some, if you knew going in, there was a 3 sigma event, there's legs here, right? There's other things like sudden stratospheric warming events though. I want to find an easier example to show. Like 2009 is a good example, where you have some sort of energy flux from the troposphere into the stratosphere, and then that disrupts your stratosphere polar vortex. It can result in a split if strong enough, and then you get this downward propagation of negative NAM anomalies from the stratosphere into the troposphere, and that actually has like some sort of legs to it as well, where you could have blocking in your troposphere for a number of months. Like it could be up to anywhere from 1 month, 2 months, maybe sometimes 3 months. But it does depend on the event, and it depends on the season. But there is one of my dreams, right, is to kind of go out and build now a statistical model that looks at similar instances in history using a three-dimensional view of the atmosphere and the NAM framework, and understand how things are evolving with time, what the forecast calls for in the models, and kind of connecting the dots to be able to say, hey, these are the events that are meaningful, and there's a 30% chance for a significant interaction, or vice versa, to give out a probabilistic assessment instead of the tropics now looking at something independent into the stratosphere troposphere base. That's where I really want to go at some point. Where I think, hopefully I'll get there at some point in the next couple of years here. But I mean, it's a big data problem. You have to be able to reconstruct your time series back historically for every layer of the atmosphere. You have to download your reanalysis back into historical levels. I mean, I did a lot of this work already, but then connecting the forecast modules to this with the same spatial resolution and vertical resolution, it gets a little trickier, and from a software engineering design perspective. So, but yes, there is a pathway there, Dave, and I'm convinced there's something there to help us with predictability in seasons, or at least interseasonally.
Just as soon as you develop it, you reach out to us and we'll do another webinar session. How's that?
Yeah.
We have the deal? All right, great. After that, you can go to the Tonight Show, but first up. All right, well, thank you so much, and thank you for the extended time, Mike. It was really great having you, and I do hope we can have you back soon. And for folks who would like to talk further with Mike, please, he's on the Knowledge Exchange. Don't hesitate to go there, reach out to him, connect with Mike. I'm sure he'll be happy to help there. And also, we have a lot of other videos, almost as good as Mike's, on our Knowledge Exchange channel. So again, Mike, thanks again, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, Dave, for having me. It's been a pleasure.